go straight to bed after we're done with this. Yeah. So today's session is meant to be interactive, but it's going to be slightly challenging with the webinar format. So I think if you could use the chat box or raise hands, like if I ask questions, if you want to say yes, etc., it might help me understand a little bit on what you know, how much I need to, like how much depth I need to go in, or if I can skip over some things. So from what I've understood, you've already undergone intense training on the UN negotiations on the various tracks. And today we're going to talk about the negotiating process. But before we get into the details of the negotiations process, let's do a brief overview of how that looks like, what it looks like actually, how does it take place, what does the background look like, and things like that. So I'll be showing some slides on and off. I don't have a very, I'm not going to run through a presentation throughout, and I can share these slides later on with the team and they can send them to you. So where I feel like there might be, it's useful to have a slide, I'll share my screen. Otherwise, I'll do without. If at any point you have any questions, feel free to either put it in the chat, or I think maybe if you raise your hand, I might be able to see it. And then the team can help either for you to put in the chat or to bring you so that you can unmute. Yeah, so diving right into it, before we get into any details, first things first, can you tell me what is the history, or can someone, or can you tell me if you know what is the history of the international climate policy? Like, what did it look like? When was the first climate change conference that ever took place internationally? Any guesses? Can you put it in the chat or in the Q&A box? Like, when did the first international climate change conference take place? And who hosted it?
We are getting some answers in chat box.
Yeah, we're getting some. Any others that you want to put in the chat? Okay, so there are two for Rio, 1992, in Rio, 1972, Stockholm Conference, Rio Convention in 1992. Any other guesses? More for the Rio Earth Summit. The Paris Agreement. Okay, any other last guesses from somebody? Brundtland or Our Better Planet? Okay, so lots of different guesses. Right and wrong at the same time. The first international conference regarding climate change was hosted by the WMO. So the WMO is the World Meteorological Organization. And this took place in 1979. And 1979, if you calculate, is 45 years ago. So 45 years ago, there was a conference hosted by the WMO, which spoke about climate change and which said that climate change could be an issue for humankind. And it also mentioned that it's happening due to human activities and that we need to start understanding how we consume and use fossil fuels and what we need to do. So while, of course, it didn't have all of the details and all of the information and the science the way we do today, I think it had enough evidence back in 1979 to already talk about climate change and to know that this is an issue. So the first international conference on climate specifically, the Stockholm Conference spoke about environment in various ways. It happened in 1972, but on climate change specifically was 1979. And then, of course, there were multiple different things. But after 1979, the next big milestone, of course, things have happened in between them. But the next big milestone was, so between the WMO and the IPCC, they came together to form, the WMO and the UNEP, UNEP and WMO came together to jointly form what is now known as the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This IPCC was basically set up in 1988. So it happened about 10 or 9 years after this first conference. And then in a couple of years after that was when there was an INC. So anyone here has heard about the current INCs on plastic, the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee or something like this, I forgot what it's called. But basically on the plastics treaty that is coming up. You can just write a yes or no in the chat. Anyone has heard about the INC on plastics that is currently going on since the last a year or so? Yes, you heard of it. Okay, There are a few yeses coming in. So yeah, the ScienceE is basically to set up a possible negotiation process on the use of plastics. So back in late 1980s or early 1990s, basically, there was this INC that was set up for climate change. So this was the INC, which then, by the end of this INC, it was concluded that there will be a formal UN body on climate change. So of course, there was a series of processes, things like that took place. But it's interesting to see that now what we're seeing today on plastics, very similar process to that many years ago, about 30 years ago, on climate change was what took place. Okay, so that was basically the history of it. And then we come to the 1992 Rio Earth Summit that many of you know about. And if you don't know about it, there's a lot to hear about the Rio Earth Summit. The most notable things were the outcomes of the Rio Earth Summit. So there were three notable UN bodies that came out of this. One was, of course, the UNFCCC, so the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Today, we're going to be solely focusing on this. Then the second one is the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the third is the UNCCD, so the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. So these three are called the Rio Conventions or the sister conventions because they've all come out of the Rio Earth Summit back in 1992. And if you haven't heard yet, there was a wonderful speech. I think it's available very easily on YouTube. There was a wonderful speech by a young person at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit called, the young girl was called Sevan Suzuki Kallis. Of course, now she's a mother. And she, as a young person, spoke a lot and basically represented the youth at the Rio Earth Summit and mentioned demands of what youth wanted from their leaders and from the governments. And if you listen to her and you see what she was saying back then, and you listen to young people today, it's actually very similar. The demands of youth back in 1992, the requests of what young people wanted, of course, we didn't have, like I said, we have a lot more evidence, a lot more science today. But the basic essence of it was very, very similar to what youth were demanding back in 1992. So it's interesting to see that over 30 years ago, I mean, young people were already involved in the process. They were already advocating for change. They were already speaking to governments. They were already speaking to world leaders. They were at these, decision-making processes and asking for change. Of course, we need more of that, a lot more of that, including even today, given that it is much more complicated, it is a lot more urgent, and of course, we have a lot more young people. But it is interesting to see how the participation of young people has happened back from 1992 onwards, or maybe even earlier than that. 1992 is basically what we've been recognizing. Okay. So that's a very quick history. And we've spoken about now the three Rio conventions. We're going to be focusing only on the UN climate change process, which is known as the negotiation process. It is hosted by the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I'm sure this is something all of you know. You've all heard about COPs. This is why we're here. This is a Youth for COP program, right? So can you write in the chat, what is the full form of a COP? What does a COP stand for? Okay, Conference of Parties. Lots of them, lovely. Okay, so COP stands for Conference of Parties. What does a party stand for? What does a party mean? Stakeholders, nations, negotiations, negotiators and stakeholders, nation states. Okay. So yeah, like most of you have said, basically party is a country that is a part of the UN process. So they have signed up to the UNFCCC. They've basically signed into the convention, and which is why they're a party to the convention. So because they're a party to the convention, it's a conference of parties. What does this mean? It's a very simply, like I said, right? It's a conference of parties. A party is a country that is signed on to the convention, which means that this decision making at the conference is taken by the parties, is taken by the countries. It is their conference specifically, as the name suggests. So Conference of Parties includes, okay, tell me the next question. Okay, how many parties or how many countries are party to the UNFCCC? How many parties does the UNFCCC have? Any guesses? 196, 197, 197, 193. Okay, lots of different guesses, very close. We have 198 parties. 197 countries plus the European Union, right? So 197 plus 1. There are 198 parties to the UNFCCC. The European Union, so the countries in Europe are parties, and then the European Union also joins in as its own party. So the European Union also negotiates as a bloc. Okay, so that's the number of countries. These countries come together to make decisions on climate, which means that if you want to be a part of the decision-making process, if you want to basically not be a part, but if you want to affect the decision-making process, you have to influence these parties who make the decision, which is why it is called an intergovernmental decision-making process. You'll hear this word 1,000 times. If you haven't heard it yet, make a note of it, but I'm sure you've probably heard of it already. An intergovernmental decision-making process, which means decisions happen between governments. As civil society, we can influence, we can lobby, we can advocate. There's a bunch of different things that we can do, which we'll get into today. But the decisions, the final decisions are made by countries. Okay, so that is one side of things, right? So we have the COP, we have the parties to the COP, we have the decision-making process. The other thing to learn about the decision-making process is that it is a consensus-based decision-making process, which means that every single party that is part of the process has a say in the process, right? So if there's someone who does not agree to what's happening, they can always raise and they can, halt the negotiation process to a certain extent. Decisions are made by consensus, which means that every single party has to agree. And these decisions are, of course, text, so they have to agree to every single word on the text. So the latest text, for example, the Paris Agreement, which is now what we're all talking about, every single party had agreed on every single word in the Paris Agreement. You can assume now we're about 120 of us, slightly more than that on the call today. Let's assume we were all together and we had to decide what kind of food we're going to eat this evening. We're going to go out for dinner, and what are we going to eat? Can you imagine how easy or not that decision making would be? This is just very simple to decide on what cuisine you want to eat this evening. Now imagine a much more complicated process, right? We're talking about climate change, we're talking about national governments, we're talking about national priorities, we're talking about action at local plus international level. So 198 countries have 198 national priorities. Each country has very different issues that they want to focus on nationally, very different problems, very different economic statuses, and very different realities to climate change. So when they have to make decisions on climate, when they have to agree to every single word, which has legal implication, you can assume how slow and tedious this process can be. Which is why sometimes it takes forever to move ahead. It takes forever when we say negotiations have come to a roadblock, parties are disagreeing on the text. There are multiple different reviews. And then, of course, if you add in the extra geopolitics, if you add in, different actors that come into play, if you add in sort of behind the scenes like lobbying, there is a lot more complications to that you can then, like layers of complications that get added on. Okay, so that is basically just a brief overview on what the process looks like. Now, at the UNFCCC, there are different negotiating bodies. Can you tell me if you've heard about these negotiation bodies? Have you heard about the COP, the CMP, the CMA, the SBI, the SBSTA? Can you write either a yes, no, maybe, not sure, or anything else in the chat so I understand how much you know? Okay, there's a yes and no, yes and no. Okay, so you've heard a little bit. I think some people know some people don't. So we'll do, to bring everyone on the same page, we'll do a quick sort of overview of all of this. Everyone has heard about a COP, right? This is exactly why we're here, but it's a Youth for COP program. So now, when we come to a UN conference, basically, we're all talking about the COP. The COP is the supreme decision-making body. So the GOP, or the Conference of Parties, is basically the supreme decision-making body in the UNFCCC, which means that all negotiations, all decisions have to be adopted by the COP. And once they're adopted by the COP, that is the final outcome of it. Now, in addition to this, there are two other governing bodies, right? So there are two other governing bodies. There is the CMP and there is the CMA. Have you heard about the CMP and the CMA? Can you write a yes, no, or a maybe in the chat? And if you know, can you tell me the full form of a CMP or a CMA? Okay, loads of no's. There's one yes and some maybe. Okay. A CMP. Okay. Long, small abbreviation to very long word. It is the conference of the parties to the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. So you can find this online on the UNFCCC website. You can note it down if you want to, but basically it is a long version, short, made sort of abbreviated into the CMP. Conference of the parties to the meeting of the parties for the Kyoto Protocol. So basically, the CMP talks about the protocol, P for protocol, which means that the Kyoto Protocol, which was started back in the 1990s, there was a second iteration of that in 2002 or something like this. Now I'm getting the dates slightly confused. But anyway, so the Kyoto Protocol was the first big agreement under the UNFCCC. And this had its second version as well, the second iteration of the Kyoto Protocol. So all negotiations under the Kyoto Protocol, so basically when it was set up, when the Kyoto Protocol was set up, in the lead after the Kyoto Protocol, in the implementation phase, and in the second phase of the Kyoto Protocol, all of the negotiations happened under the CMP. And then the CMP is in the supreme decision-making body, and then the COP adopts the decisions of the CMP. The other governing body that we have now is the CMA. The CMA, again, short abbreviation for a long word, Conference of Parties to the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. So very similar structure for the Paris Agreement. We've had the CMA now since 2015, since the Paris Agreement was adopted. Until then, we didn't have any CMA. So all negotiations for the Paris Agreement specifically now take place under the CMA. So when you go to a COP, when you go and look at the agenda, it will tell you CMA agenda item, whatever. It is not going to tell you what, like, it is for you to then understand and decipher what this means. So if you see CMA agenda item, or if you see some other wording there, you can understand that this is negotiation item under the CMA or the CMP. We phased out of the CMP now, so there's not much going on under the CMP because the Kyoto Protocol is now officially over. There could be some lingering topics here and there leading on under the Paris Agreement, but more or less we phased out of the CMP. So now most of the negotiation items are under the CMA. The other two decision-making bodies are called the subsidiary bodies. These are the two permanent bodies under the UNFCCC. The CMP, CMA have been made as and when different agreements, protocols, etc. have come into place. They are not permanent decision-making bodies, right? But the subsidiary bodies are the two permanent decision-making bodies under the COP. The subsidiary bodies, so the COP meets once a year. The CMP, CMA meet once a year. The subsidiary bodies are special. They meet twice a year. So they meet once in the summer at the UN Climate Change Headquarters. That's where the meetings happen. Some of you might have heard about it. You might have been there. And these are called the SBs or the intersessions. So basically, this is the meeting of the subsidiary bodies. It's a very similar negotiation process, except these are agenda items which only come under the two subsidiary bodies, which is the SBI and the SBSTA. The SBI is short for Subsidiary Body for Implementation, and SBSTA is short for Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice. Now, the role of these two subsidiary bodies, right? I said they meet twice a year. So they meet once in the summer, and the second time they meet in the winter. The meeting during the winter happens at the same time during the COP. So if you go to a COP, you will have agenda items under the CMP, under the COP, agenda items under the CMA, and you will have agenda items under this the SB. So either the SBI or the SBSTA. It will say SBSTA agenda item 4, whatever, or CMA agenda item 3, what things are this. So we can look at some of the previous COP, the agendas of the COP and try and understand what this language looks like. But all you need to know is that basically the negotiation tracks or negotiations basically happen in tracks under these decision-making bodies. Now, the way that it works is, it's a bit like a government, right? So you have the government at the national level, then you have state or provincial level, or depends on how you call it in your country, but basically state level governments. And then there are local level governments. So it's a very crude analogy, but basically it's something similar in that, just for you to get an understanding of what it looks like. So the SBs, or the subsidiary bodies, are basically the permanent decision-making bodies. A lot of agenda items happen here. Once the SBs adopt the decisions, these adopted decisions go to the COP, and then the COP adopts the decisions, and then they're final. So when we say that, there's a lot of work that happens at the SBs, but you have to wait until the COP to see the outcomes, this is basically what it means. While decisions are adopted at the SBs, the final decision needs to go to the COP, because COP is the supreme decision-making body. So this is basically what you need to know. When you go into a COP, you need to understand what negotiation item you want to follow. What does it look like? You need to be able to read the agenda and figure out what day, what time, where it is happening, right? Only then you'll be able to follow this. And if you do not understand these words, you're never going to be able to understand what is written on the screens or on the online platform. You'll be reading and it all looks Greek and Latin to you. So you need to understand these words before you enter a COP, so that you can at least think about, okay, this is where it is, this is what I can find, this is what I need to know. Let me send you a link to the UNFCCC process. Yeah, I'm going to put this in the chat. Basically, this talks about the COP. It talks about basically everything that I've spoken right now. And then you can go into detail and read more, right? So this has a lot more information. In addition to all of this, there is something known as the constituted bodies. So the constituted bodies are very specific. They focus on different topics, and they support the UNFCCC in different implementation or different sort of work programs. So you'll hear a bunch of different names. You'll hear about, let's say, the Adaptation Committee. You'll hear about the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, Loss and Damage, the WIM EXCOM, the Executive Committee, things like this. There are lots of different constituted bodies. So if you go on this website, I think this also has the list to all of the constituted bodies, what they do, things like that. So at the COP, there will be sometimes constituted bodies meetings. There will be negotiations under the SPI and the SubStar. There will be negotiations under the CMA, and then finally the COP. At the COP, the SB's negotiations conclude in the first week. Then there's a closing plenary of the SBs. And then the negotiations go into the CMP or the CMA. And then there's a closing of the COP. So that's how the negotiations work. Okay. So now this is on the basics, the structure of sort of what the negotiations look like. Let me show you. Just give me 1 second to fish out the slide that I wanted to show you. Yeah. It's not the best in terms of the presentation, but you should at least you can get an idea of what I mean, and then you can look at the details on the UNFCCC website. So like I said, the parties are basically the ones that make the decisions. And then, of course, there's the UNFCCC Secretariat that supports the implementation. It gives technical support. It gives basically helps advise the way the structure, the flow, everything in the negotiations. And there's the COP, Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement. So the COP, CMP, and CMA, and then the subsidiary bodies who feed into this. So it's a little bit of a maze, but you get the idea of what I was trying to say. This is another way of looking at it, right? So there's the parties, there's the COP, CMP, CMA. They mandate the subsidiary bodies. So everything on science, basically and technology happens under the SubStar, and everything regarding implementation. So basically, how is the UNFCCC going to put this into play? Happens under the SBI, and then this goes back. Decision is then adopted at the COP, and then that's how the decisions are made, right? And the UNFCCC Secretariat basically here provides technical support. It helps ensure that basically the entire process is supported by the UNFCCC Secretariat. So like I said, it is a country-driven, it's an intergovernmental decision-making process, and it is consensus-based. So let me stop here for like 5 seconds. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, I don't see anything so far, so then we'll continue. Lovely. Okay. So this is the understanding of how the COP, like the negotiations at COP happens. Now, outside of negotiations, what else happens at COP? A lot of young people say, I want to speak at a COP, or I want to go and I want to advocate, I want to lobby, I want to do something, right? What you need to understand is that the main reason for the COP, or basically the reason why this happens, like I said, it is a negotiation process, right? This is not a conference like other conferences. It's not like a paper presentation or things like this. Of course, there are a bunch of things that happen by the side of it, but the essence of the conference is the negotiations. If you want to say what is the outcome of, let's say, last year's COP, right? COP28, what are the outcomes of COP28? The outcome that you're going to talk about is this outcome of the negotiation process. So there's no other outcome. We're not talking about anything else. It's the outcome of the negotiations. So the main aim of the COP is negotiations. In addition to this, there are a bunch of different things that happen. There are lots of different events which are called side events, right? You might have heard of this. Some of you, if you've been to a COP already, you've probably been part of side events. You've either organized, you've spoken, you've attended, whatever that might be. So all of these side events take place simultaneously during the same 2 weeks. The UNFCCC has an application process. Accredited organizations or NGOs can apply to host side events. You can collaborate, you can do whatever, right? So these side events are either hosted by, officially by the UNFCCC listed side events. And there are also pavilions. So countries have pavilions, not necessarily every country, but many countries have pavilions, which basically means it's a physical space. The country usually showcases, national policies, it showcases tourism, it showcases what it's doing for climate action, things like this. It's a space to promote the work that every country is doing. So countries have pavilions, and organizations could also have pavilions, right? So at these pavilions, it's basically a physical space. So at these pavilions, the pavilion, whoever is basically the host of the pavilion, also can do, if they want to, can do programmatic, like they can do different panels, presentations, whatever they want to. So they can also host like different events at that pavilion every day. So there are official side events, and then there are events happening at the pavilion. So the official side events you can find on the UNFCCC website. They'll have a list of all of the side events because there is a huge process you have to apply beforehand. They approve, it's a very long, slightly, not very complicated, but slightly tedious process, not complicated, but tedious process on how these side events happen. So that you can find on the list. The programming for pavilions usually is not really found in one central place. Maybe if the pavilion itself has its own website or a list or a portal somewhere, you can find it there, but each individual pavilion may or may not have their updates on this. So basically, there's a lot happening just outside of the negotiations as well. But like I said, this is a space for the negotiations. If you're going to the COP, what I would recommend is, as much as possible, try and attend these negotiations. Try and sit into rooms that might be open, and we'll talk about open, closed, all of these things. But try and sit into the negotiation rooms and observe the negotiations. They might be very boring. If you're doing this for the first time, you might not understand what's happening. But the only way to understand them is by being in the room. Yes, no matter how much training you get outside, unless you're sitting and watching a negotiation take place firsthand in real time, it is a very different experience altogether. So there's a question in the chat: official side event can only be organized by states? No. That's an application process. UNFCCC has a list of accredited organizations, and which are basically civil society organizations, and they can apply to host these side events. I do not remember now the timeline for this year. I don't know if it's passed or if it's yet to happen, but basically accredited organizations can apply for a side event, and then the UNFCCC looks at them. They sort of, approve or reject them based on, or sometimes they ask organizations to merge. So a lot of the times there's a window for organizations to talk to each other and merge their side event. And then on the pavilions, of course, they can, at the pavilions, there's no restriction. They can do whatever they want on their pavilions. They can choose the programming the way that they want to. So at a lot of these spaces is where, whether you're a young person, whether you're an expert, whatever that might be, a lot of these spaces, people might invite you to speak, people might invite you to listen. They might say, this is what we're hosting at 4 p.m. on this day. Please come to our pavilion. This is where it's located. And please attend our side event on, XYZ. So there's a lot of conversations that happen at the side events. The side events are a great space to network. It's a great space to learn about what's happening in the world on climate. For example, technology, for example, energy, whatever you name it, right? There will definitely be something or the other on that particular topic. So it is a great space to meet people, especially from civil society. It is a great space to build your networks, build your connections, to learn about what's going on. But none of that affects the outcomes of the negotiations. So if you want to understand the negotiations, you have to be in the negotiation rooms. If you're sitting at side events and speaking at side events and doing media interviews, all of that is great. It's lovely. It's good for social media. It's good to get the word out. You might make a ton of different contacts, which is all lovely. These are good byproducts of the COP, right? But if you want to affect the negotiations, you have to be in the negotiation room and you have to understand how that functions to be able to affect it. So yeah, definitely not saying don't do side events. I think they're a brilliant space to meet other people, like-minded people, and a brilliant space to network, to learn more, all of that. But the negotiations are also, so it depends on what your interest is and why you want to go to a COP. So that is one side of things. So if you're there as a COP, if you're there at the COP, you CSOs cannot speak in negotiations. Most often, no. You can be part of constituencies, and I'll come to that in just a moment. I was just getting there. And that's how you can possibly speak. By you, I mean like civil society, but otherwise, you're not part of you cannot speak in the negotiations. You can sit and observe the negotiations. So basically, when you go to a COP, you go more often than not, you go as an observer. So the badge that you will get is an observer badge. I have another slide somewhere on this. And I'll show that to you in just a bit. So, but more often than not, basically, when you go to a COP, you have a badge which will state observer. So it'll be basically a yellow stripe at the bottom, which is an observer badge. People who are part of national delegations will have a badge which says party at the bottom, and it'll have the name of the party. It won't say party, it'll be a pink badge and it'll have the name of the country that's that's given them the badge. And then if you're part of, let's say media, if you're on a media badge, it's an orange color badge. So, but just by looking at the colors, you can differentiate. And now I think they're also changing like the shades and the colors slightly, but usually like a blue badge would be, like a blue colored badge would be a UNFCCC or a UN, basically a UN entity. So you have a UN observer and things like this. Sometimes over the last year or two, I've noticed slightly different colors. So I think they're also like experimenting a little bit, but in general, like this is what it looks like. And I can share the slide. So this is in general what it looks like. You will be there. Your name, your badge will more or less look like this. Your photo, you'll have a sort of a barcode that will be scanned every time you leave, you walk in or come out. So you'll more often than not have a yellow badge, which is an observer badge. And then countries will have a pink badge with the name of the party written here. If it's a head of delegation, it'll be a different color. It'll be a dark pink or a red. Used to be a red, sometimes now it's a dark pink or a purplish, which is basically signifying that they're a party head. It's the head of delegation. This is the secretariat or a UN, and generally like there used to be green badges. I haven't seen them very often now, but they were basically like other IGOs. And this is, of course, orange badge as a press. More or less, this is what it is. Then there is sort of a grayish, which is technical support or like something like this. So they have different colored badges. And I think now and then they're creating slightly more different ways of, I think, bringing people in. So there are slight changes, but for sure, there will be party in pink, observers in yellow. This is not going to change, and media in orange. Is there any criteria or qualification needed to be an observer? Yeah. So I'll come to that in a bit. So basically, you will participate. If you do go to a COP, you will participate as an observer. Now, how do you participate as an observer? That's the question here. To get an observer badge, basically to get any sort of badge to a COP, more 99.9% an observer badge, you need to be part of an accredited observer organization. If you look up UNFCCC list of accredited observer organizations, you will get a list of all of the organizations from across the world that are accredited to the UNFCCC. There is a process to accredit your organization. It usually takes a very long time for this accreditation. It takes about 1.5 or 2 years. You need a lot of paperwork. You need to have an organization and statements and, audit reports for the past 3 years, things like this, to get accredited. And they have a deadline by which you need to send in. So basically, if you, I don't know, let's assume like you have an organization that you want to get accredited. If you send it in now, it will not be ready for COP29, but it will be ready, I think, for COP30, depending on the timeline. If the deadline was August, then it will not be ready for COP30. It will be ready for COP 31. Anyway, so sometimes more often than not, end of August is usually the deadline. So you can find all of this information on the UNFCCC website on how to register an organization. So accredited organizations basically get passes or badges, as we call it. Accredited organizations get a certain number of badges every year. This number changes from year to year. There are different reasons of basically the quota. This is called a quota. So that sometimes we say there's a smaller quota this year, there's a larger quota this year, like we barely got any badges, all of that. Now, this quota changes based on multiple different factors, one of them being the venue. So like how big is the venue, how much like capacity how many people can it take every day, things like this. And then a bunch of different things like how many observer organizations are accredited, all of that. So year on year, more and more observer organizations are getting accredited to the COP, which means that, for example, even if the venue size was exactly the same every year, there is more demand for the same number of seats. But of course, that is not the case. And every year it is a different venue. It is a different country, which means that the venue size is either bigger or smaller. Last year was a super large venue. I think it was the largest COP in terms of numbers ever, over 100,000 people that were registered. And this year in Azerbaijan, that the venue is much smaller. I don't think there's going to be any COP, at least that in the near future, that is as large as the COP in Dubai. Like the venue in Dubai was already pre-made for the expo and things like this. So they had a very large venue, which was then utilized for the COP. Usually in the past, of course, the Paris COP was pretty large, but in comparison to that, the Dubai COP was much, much larger. But again, so the number of badges changes every year based on multiple different factors. And then, of course, parties or countries also send delegations, right? So they have negotiators. So their delegation will be much larger. There'll be official negotiators. Sometimes they have legal teams. Sometimes they have support staff. And then, of course, some parties have good relations with civil society or with other sort of stakeholders. Sometimes they also give badges to civil society. So you can also be on a party badge, but basically not be a negotiator. So you can be there as part of like in terms of your badge as part of a party, but you will not be part of the main core negotiating delegation. And there are lots of instances of some countries giving hundreds and hundreds of badges, either to civil society or however that works, right, to different stakeholders. Even at the Dubai COP, there were a few examples of some countries that gave a lot of different badges for other people, which basically means that and countries do not have a quota, which means that if countries are giving more badges, it also takes away in the space from the observer organizations. Observer organizations all have quotas. States do not have quotas. Who are the negotiators? The negotiators are basically as part of the national delegation. So they're usually decided by the country. More often than not, they are civil servants. But it depends on the government on who they want to bring in. They could be consultants, they could be whatever. Are students allowed to be an observer? So like I said, an organization is an observer. Now the organization has the authority on who they want to nominate on behalf of their organization, right? So they can sort of open up their badges. They can give it to their own staff or to however they want to do this. So there's no restriction on who they give their badge to, but the organization is the one that receives the badge, and the organization then can decide. So one way, like I said, is check out the UNFCCC website for the list of accredited observer organizations. This is your best bet on trying to find a badge for COP. Look at the list of organizations, see what their work is, see if there's any in your country or even in some other part of the country. See if you want to reach out to them, ask them, hi, this is the work that you're doing. This is what I'm interested in. I would like to be a part of your team for COP. Maybe I can help support. Don't just go asking for badges like just because you want to go to COP. Offer something that you can do for them so that they find value in giving you a badge. Why would they just give you a badge for the fun of it? They would rather give it to someone as part of their team or to someone who's going to benefit them in any way, right? So the first thing that you need is badge. And then, of course, you need funding. So you can either pay your own flight and accommodation, which then guarantees that you're going to go there. But if you don't have the funding, then you can reach out to different stakeholders for funding. Some organizations might give funding, some might not. It really depends on what it looks like. And now there are also a bunch of different, scholarships and things like this that are open that you can apply for, especially for young people. Youth and climate in general are two of the most sort of sought after things these days. So there's a lot of different opportunities. So keep an eye out on all of these networks. I'm sure that IICN, Climate Reality and Cancer are also probably sharing things that come your way. So just keep an eye out for all of these and apply for them. So that's basically on how do you get to a COP, right? So once you have the badge, you're at the COP, you're then free to do what you want to do. Unless, of course, there's an organization or whatever that tells you what you need to do. But basically, like you're there and the whole space is open to you. So when you go to a COP, you will often hear about, or even before the COP, you'll hear about the different zones. You'll hear about a blue zone, you'll hear about a green zone. Sometimes these are called slightly different names, but generally they're called a blue and green zone. What does this mean? Anyone knows what a blue zone or a green zone is? Any guesses? Take a guess. Can you put in the chat? Okay, so blue zone is for parties only. Blue zone is when negotiations happen. Right. So yeah, some correct answers, some in the middle. So basically the blue zone, like some of you have said in the chat, the blue zone is basically where all the negotiations happen. But this is also where all the side events happen, where the pavilions are. So everything that I've mentioned so far right now happens in the blue zone. Right, so this is all part of the COP. So there are pavilions, the official pavilions, the official side events, and the negotiations all happen in the blue zone. And then there is a green zone. The green zone, getting a badge to the green zone is a lot more easier. I think each COP has its own process. It's not as complicated. You don't need an accredited organization to get a badge for green zone. Green zone originally started, I think if I'm not wrong, the green zone first was introduced at the COP in Paris in 2015 at COP 21. I'm not sure if it happened earlier, but I think that was the first time it happened. And that was basically more or less to bring the people of Paris together and to involve them in the national process. So I could be wrong. Maybe it's not necessarily the first time, but I think from what I know that was the first time. Yeah. So in terms of basically that was, sorry, I was just reading some comments in the chat. Yeah. So I think back in 2015 was the first time, and the Green Zone had to bring in the people of Paris and the people of France to be a part of this process. Not exactly in, because of course then they need badges, but right around the space. So this has been continuing year on year. And like I said, the green zone is very simple to get access to. I think you can Google, I don't remember what the process is right now, but you will, like as COP comes closer, you're very easy to get access to. But all of this that we've talked about so far all happens in the blue zone. So if you want to be a part of the negotiations, if you want to be at official side events or be part of pavilions, you need a badge to the blue zone. And to get a badge to the blue zone, you need through an accredited observer organization or a country or a media house, right? So these three are the most simplest ways of getting it, or the most obvious ways, maybe not simplest, but the most obvious ways of getting a badge. So that is on basically just like physically getting into a COP. Now, in addition to all of this, right? So once you're at the COP, this is, what you can do. Let me also send you actually another link. Yeah, so this is, I think, the accredited observer organizations. You can also look at it. Okay, so once you're at the COP, what do you do now? Okay, you've gotten a badge, you've gotten funding, whether you're paying it yourself, whether you're getting externally, whatever that means. Okay, you've made your way to, let's say, COP 29 Azerbaijan, you're there. What do you do? Ideally, you figure this out before you go to a COP. So you're not going into a COP and going like, okay, now what do I do? And this is why we're talking about it today, right? So what do you do when you're at a COP? How do you engage? So the first thing that I would recommend is understand what are the ways that civil society can participate. And how can you do this? By looking at the UNFCCC constituencies. Can someone tell me, have you heard about the word constituency? What is a constituency? What does it mean? Can you put it in the chat, please? What is a constituency? Okay, there's one don't know. Anybody else? If you don't know, you can say you don't know, because then that helps me and I can explain better. Okay, don't know. Administrative area, one of them is Yangon. Okay, so basically a constituency, or basically constituencies are basically mandated mechanisms or basically groups of observer organizations Well, I've used a lot of big words. Let me let me break this down. Yeah, like we say, there's a group of people represent. Yeah. So basically, constituencies were created for civil society to to have a way of participating in the COP and to have a voice in the process. Like I said to start off with, this is an intergovernmental decision-making process, right? Which means that decisions are made by governments. So as civil society, what can we do? So this question was brought up multiple times, and then constituencies were created to help solve this problem. So there are 9 different constituencies, broadly covering various various groups of civil society. Now, if you look up, I think the list that I sent you, it also looks at the different constituencies, but basically there are 9 different constituencies. And these are mandated mechanisms of how civil society can be a part of it. So when someone says, I think there was a question earlier a little while ago saying, as an observer, you can't speak in the negotiations. You cannot speak in the negotiations. But there are sometimes, in some negotiations, they open up for inputs from constituencies. And that is the way that you can be a part of the process, which is why I highly recommend, and especially in the opening and closing plenaries, constituencies will be given the floor to speak. So that is the chance for civil society to bring their views, opinions, all of that into the process officially. You will be able to speak in the same room as parties will speak. By you, I don't mean you as individuals, but the constituency as a whole. So each constituency has its own way of functioning, has its own way of decision making, has its own way of deciding how they write these statements, who can be a part of it, all of that. Yango is the one for youth, but I would recommend, while you should engage in Yango, I would recommend don't restrict yourself necessarily only to one constituency. There are multiple different constituencies. Maybe you can fit into more than one. If you're a young person, of course, the most obvious is Yango, but there are lots of different, if you're a young student, if you're a researcher, for example, you could try and be part of the Ringos, which is the research and independent NGOs. Then there is businesses. Maybe you're a young entrepreneur. Maybe you want to be part of a business community. There's the Bingos, which is for businesses. There are some that are trade unions. Some young people can be part of trade unions. You could be part of the Tongos, which is for trade unions. So there's a list. There are 9 different constituencies, basically. Indigenous peoples. Maybe you're a young indigenous person. You could be part of the IPOs for indigenous people. So there are different ways of how you can or cannot participate. So I would highly recommend that understand how all of these constituencies work. For women and gender, for example, there is also working a constituency on the women and gender. So there are, and then there's LGMA, which is local governments and municipal authorities. I think I covered all the 9. Anyway, and the NGOs, sorry. The NGOs is the environmental NGOs. So NGOs is broken into 2. They'd had a split some years ago and they have 2. So there is now I've forgotten what they're called. I know that I talk about this every day and now I've had a blank. Anyway, so there are 2. There is, why am I forgetting these names? It'll come to me in a few seconds. But basically, environmental NGOs can also be part of the process. Basically, they have their own constituency. So look and see which ones you can be a part of. Like I said, let me try and send you a link. I think I have it somewhere. I think the link I sent earlier should show you the constituencies. But anyway, this is a document by the UNFCCC, basically, which talks about what a constituency is, how it functions, and things like this. This is just as an FYI, for example, if you want to know. Yeah, so let me try and show you this. Give me 1 second. So basically, the names that I said, if I've forgotten any, you will be able to visually see this here. Yeah. So these are the different constituencies. Like I said, civil society works in different ways. So there is the businesses, researchers, there's farmers, which I'd forgotten, sorry. Farmers, trade unions, women and gender, indigenous peoples, environmental NGOs, local governments, municipal authorities, and children. It is currently named alphabetically because that's usually how, or maybe no, it's actually not alphabetic. Okay. Yeah, well, usually they're called out alphabetically when they're given statements. So these are the different constituencies. Constituencies will have their meetings in the lead up to, will have the meetings at COP every morning. They might have, each constituency will have a meeting, etc. So try and engage in these constituency meetings. Sometimes they're overlapping, so you'll have to choose which one you want to be at, of course, if they're all happening in the morning at the same time, because they have 1 hour in the morning where constituencies hold their meetings. So you can't definitely be part of more than one constituency meeting at one time. So pick and choose, see where you want to engage, see what works best for you, and then choose what you might want to work in. Youngo is a great space. I've been part of Youngo for a very long time. I was leading Youngo for about 2 years. So I know very intimately how that has worked in the past. But we also, as focal points for the 2 years that I was focal point, worked very closely with the other focal points of the other constituencies, and they're all doing amazing work in their own ways. So I would highly recommend to see which is a good fit for you and then work accordingly. So that is in terms of the first step on how you can engage, right? So basically that is your best bet is to be, because constituencies follow the negotiations. They have different ways in how they follow. They have different people following different things. Sorry, now I remember the names. So the NGOs basically have CAN and DCJ, Demand Climate Justice, and the Climate Action Network. And then they basically have their own ways of working. Anyway, so as constituencies is one of the best ways to work. And then, of course, through that, and the reason why I've said this multiple times is because through this, you will, one, get to know other people. You will get daily updates on what's going on. You will be part of meetings. If you have questions, this is the lovely space to ask questions. You can create a community because you will meet people, you will get to know. And this is a really, community is very, very important, especially when you go to COP. And I cannot say how, I mean, this is one of the most valuable things is to really have a community. A COP is overwhelming. It is extremely exhausting. It tires you out. It completely confuses you, physically and mentally tires you out. And there's a lot happening at the same time. There are 500 different things. There are multiple negotiation tracks. Even if you're only focusing on negotiations, there are multiple negotiation tracks. If you're doing side events, there are thousands of side events happening at the same time. If you're trying to do both, God bless you. All the very best on how you're going to navigate that. So it is very, very confusing. And some COP venues are usually quite large. So you walk like multiple thousands and thousands of steps. 20,000 steps a day is quite normal for a person to walk. And then having someone, a familiar face, someone to ask questions to, someone to go like, I don't know what's happening, please help me. Or where is this meeting happening? I can't find the room. Like as simple as that. Like, knowing, having a familiar face is really, really helpful. And which is why I've said multiple times, like, this is where you meet people. This is why people are following negotiations. If you want to know what happened in the negotiation rooms, these are spaces where, it brings together people where you'll be able to ask these kind of questions. So yeah. And then based on that, I mean, the other way negotiation tracks, try and see, let me actually, give me 1 second to see if I can find any previous agenda items. I don't know if that's even available. Let me see. There's a schedule of meetings. Sorry, I should have pulled this up earlier. Okay, yeah, I'm going to share my screen for 1 second. Just so that you can get a glimpse of what this agenda looks like. It's going to look very different for the COP, of course, but just for you to understand when I say what this means, right? So this is the agenda for SB60. And of course, all timings are local timings, started on the 3rd of June. So you'll see informal consultation, Substar 7. Like I said, you really need to know what this is, right? Reporting from and review of parties, including Annex 1 to the convention, SBI 3A, 3B, 3C, informal consultation, right? So if you don't know what SBI 3A, 3B, 3C is, you're not going to know what is happening here. Matters relating to capacity building, informal consultation, SBI 15. So you really need to know what is SBI 15, SBI agenda item 5, is a Substar 5A, SBI 10A. So all of these different things, like you'll see this goes on and on and on. Which is why I said you really need to understand and look at these words and read them beforehand so that when you go there, you're not like, oh my God, I have no idea what SBI 13 even means. So this is one side of things. Oh, sorry, let me actually reshare my screen and show you. There's another. So here it says, there's another thing that says here, it says open meeting. So a lot of these, basically, it says open meeting. It talks about, this was the location of which room it was happening in. These are the names of the rooms at the conference center in Bonn. Let's see if there are any like closed meetings that come up. Okay, this is limited access, for example. This is still the early days of the negotiations, so they're generally all open. Okay, these are all currently open meetings. I think as we went closer towards the end of it, might be some that were probably not open. Anyway, so you get the idea of it. Basically, when it says open, or what it basically means is that it is open to everyone to attend. So it is open to observers. That's basically what it means, right? So it's open to observers to attend. If there's limited access, if it's closed, or if it says parties only, or something like this, or observers and parties only, or something like this, then it basically tells you who's allowed in the meetings. Closed meetings are generally, when they say closed, it's closed to observers and press, which means that only parties are allowed in them. And sometimes they will, like a limited access might mention who's allowed to be a part of it. So you can be, if you have a yellow, like an observer badge, you can be part of every negotiation, like you can sit in the negotiation room. That is open, basically. If it says closed, you might not be allowed in it, right? Usually the start of the negotiations, most of them are open. Sometimes as it comes towards the end of the negotiation, some contentious issues arise. There's roadblocks, there are some decision making which are, at countries that are headlocked with each other. That's when sometimes some meetings are closed. And then of course the plenaries by the end of the closing are open again. So the plenaries are all open. Most of the negotiations, at least at the start of it, are all open. And then sometimes they might close negotiations based on topic to topic. And then you might also hear informal on something, right? So you might hear an informal consultation on whatever. What does an informal consultation mean? An informal consultation is absolutely not informal. It's the most formal meeting you will be in. An informal consultation is basically a negotiation, right? First, initially they'll start with contact groups. Contact groups are also negotiations. There's different ways of saying it. Contact groups are basically the initial bits of the negotiations. Informal consultations are when they slightly then pick up pace, they go into detailed discussions on certain topics. And then sometimes, if there is a roadblock, they might go into infinf or informal informals. In short, they're called infinf. So there's an infinf from this happening at this point, or that parties have decided that tomorrow they're going to do an infinf on finance or whatever that might be, right? An infinf is usually always closed. It is parties only. It is only for parties to be there because they're trying to resolve some issues there. They do not want it to be open to everyone. There are pros and cons to this, but the reason this is closed is so that parties can freely communicate without the fear of being judged, without the fear of being quoted in media, without the fear of people going on and talking about what happened in the rooms. Of course, this information, the moment the negotiation is over, this information is available, like the documents are available if they are, and people get to know what happened in the infinf. But at the time of the meeting, at the time of the negotiation itself, it is only for parties. Party overflow badges could be there sometimes, but sometimes in an infant, even overflow badges are not allowed. It is party only. Yes, this is the type of badge that I did not mention. A party overflow is basically a badge given by a country. But if you get an overflow badge, you're of course not part of the negotiation, the co-negotiating delegation. You will be allowed in most of the meetings, but for example, like an infinf, it could be closed and it'll be parties only. So overflow badges might not be allowed in the case of an infinf. Usually infins are also much smaller. So also in terms of space, like the rooms, they just don't have space for like everyone to come and sit and watch. It's not really that, like the rooms are not that big. So they're only limited for people who actually need to be in the rooms. If you attend a negotiation, right, there will be like call it a round table, which is basically a square table with a screen on one side. And then parties will get the name of their country, like the placard, it's called a flag, will put it at the table and put in front of them, and they'll sit at the table. So if you're at the negotiation rooms, do not sit at the table that is reserved for the negotiators, because those have spaces with mics and they need to speak. There will be a rows of chairs at the back. So please sit somewhere at the back on the rows of chairs, right? So do not take a seat at the table. That is only for parties because they will need the mic to speak. Yeah, so I think that is the just sort of protocol on what you need to know. Do not go and look for a country's name and keep it with you. You're not part of a national delegation unless you officially know that you're negotiating on behalf of your country. There could be some of you that might be doing that. In general, you might not. More often than not, you're not part of your national delegation. So do not take your country's flag and like the country's name and sit in front of it. You're not representing your country. If your country's delegation comes then and realizes that you've done this, they might be very annoyed with you. So do not do that. Unless you're 100% sure that you are representing your country, you've gotten a mandate, you know who your official negotiators are, you've been a part of the team, you've had briefings, you're allowed to speak, only then you might do that. Okay. So this is basically on, well, so we've now looked at all of the different ways of engaging. Now let's go into how the negotiations happen, right? So like I said, you'll walk into this room, it'll be a square room with like a room with a square table with a screen on one side. Different parties will be sitting at the table. And what they're basically negotiating is a text. So each agenda item has its own text. And this is basically what they're negotiating. So every single word in the text, like I said at the start, is negotiated upon and can be negotiated upon. So whether it is a should or a shall or a would or a will, all of that have different implications, have different meanings, have different, when I say implications, some of them are stronger, some of them are weaker language. So all of this plays an impact on the final outcome of the negotiations. So depending on each national interest and a bunch of different factors, even sentences like smaller words like this can be negotiated on. Where a comma comes in, where a full stop comes in, sometimes some countries go like this is not grammatically correct, whatever, things like this. So it can be a very boring, tedious process, but it can also be a very fun process. So if you learn to recognize and understand and, how do you say, if you can follow what is going on in the rooms, it can be a fun process. Until you get to that stage, it can be really boring. But you will never get to that stage if you're not in the room. So being out of the room saying, oh my God, I have no idea what's going on is not going to help you understand what's going on at all. And then, of course, like I said, being part of groups that follow negotiations, talking to people who've been part of the process, whether it's other young people, whether it's other seniors, whether it's some senior negotiators, asking them if you haven't understood what's happened in the room really helps to then clarify any doubts, understand what the nuances are, things like this. So that is just the technicalities of the process, right? Now, in terms of decision making, decisions, like I said, this is a consensus-based decision-making process, which means that every country has the right to decide and to say what works and does not work for them. Now let's do a scenario play, right? Let's say there is a country, let's say, for the sake of it, let's say the United States of America, that has an objection to a particular word and says, we're not okay with this language. This is what, whatever, this says, we're not okay with this. We'd like to change XYZ in the text. What do you think the implication of that might mean? Do you think the negotiations, like people would stop, would consider, and they would have to reconsider what they're doing? Would they have to work on different words, different language? What do you think might happen in this scenario? Any guesses in the chat? Guys? Okay, let me give you a counter scenario to this. Counter scenario, okay? Let's say we have a small country called Tonga. Tonga is a small country in the Pacific, if you haven't heard about it. And let's say Tonga says that, we have an issue with XYZ language in the text. We're not okay with it. Now, there's the United States and there's Tonga. Between these two countries, who do you think, like, what side is it going to weigh? What side do you think things are going to change more? United States, Tonga, US. Okay, so a lot of different, like probably the US. So while it is a consensus-based decision-making system, which is really great, sometimes in practice, it is not necessarily so. I mean, well, it is so, but it is not necessarily so when I'm saying about the detailed nuances of it. Geopolitics plays a very, very important role in the negotiation process. So depending on who is, let's say, president or prime minister of a country, what their sort of intentions are, changes geopolitics. What is geopolitical ties between certain countries sometimes changes what it looks like. All of these different things. And then, of course, the economic status of a country, whether it's a developed country, a developing country, whether it is a small island state, all of that. So, of course, developed countries, or the global north, as we call them, is very different. The global south, the developing countries, is also slightly different. But even within the global south, for example, if there's India or China, which are big economies, India, China, Brazil, let's say, big economies, when they say something, probably has a different weightage to, like I said, Tonga or Ghana, or maybe Ghana is still relatively okay, but some smaller countries in that sense. Or Lesotho, for example. I mean, I'm just randomly naming countries that come at the top of my head at this point, but you do understand the geopolitics and the sort of the implications that it can have. So this is something which you can see out playing firsthand if you're sitting in a negotiation room, depending on what the negotiations are, how chaotic or not it is getting at one point. Yeah, and then countries also negotiate in groups. So they negotiate in blocks. So like I said, there are parties, they have, each party has its own say, but to speed up the process, they also negotiate in groupings, which means that these groupings can be geographic, they can be based on interest. Let me show you a slide which actually shows these groupings quite nicely. Yeah, this is the one. I think you should be able to see it. So this basically shows the overlapping nature of the groupings, right? So here, the biggest grouping is this one here, which is the G77 in China. Has over 134 countries. And then they overlap in other bits as well. So you can see a lot of overlap. There's the SIDS, which is the small island developing states, or basically also known as the AOSIS, which is here. There is the ALBA, there is the LDCs, which is the least developing groups, there's the African groups, Arab groups, LMDCs, which is the like-minded developing countries. ILAC is the Latin American International Association for Latin American Countries. BASIC is Brazil, South Africa, India, China, and things like this. I won't get into the details of all these names. EIG is the Environmental Integrity Group, EU Umbrella Group, Economies in Transition, so on and so forth, right? So all of these, or the OPEC, the oil producing, like you've all heard about the OPEC as well. So yeah, these are the different groupings. So countries negotiate in groupings. One, because it speeds up the process. And two, when you talk in numbers, of course, it has higher value. So let's say G77 and China is making a statement. It means that 134 countries have already agreed to everything in that statement. So G77 and China have their own negotiations actually, almost as intense, because this is the biggest group with so many different countries with very different viewpoints and very different interests. And when G77 and China, for example, makes a statement, it shows that this is so many different countries that have agreed to this statement. And it's very different for, let's say, if I don't know, only one country had to sort of speak by themselves. Like if Uruguay, let's say, had to, speak on behalf of themselves. Of course, not to say that it's not important, but when G77 and China speaks, Uruguay's voice is automatically incorporated in that process. So that is basically on how it sort of works. Negotiations usually happen in groupings, but parties could also sometimes negotiate on behalf of themselves, but more often than not, they happen in groupings. Yeah. So I think I've covered like most of these different things. I will send you to other sort of resources because I'm also noticing the time. I'll send you to other resources which actually then talk about the language and the text and the negotiations and like what that looks like. So one is this on behalf of my delegation, which was made, I think, quite recently with the IISD. And this is a lovely read. It's slightly long, but it is a lovely read. For example, like if you're going to be at COP, this is a lovely read to sort of help you get familiarized, help you understand the processes, the complications, all of that. And if you really want to understand negotiation language, the details, the nuances on this, then there is a very lovely guide put together by Ian Fry, who's a negotiator for Tuvalu, a really, really experienced negotiator. So he's put this together along with SPREP, which is the Pacific Group on Climate, which is called Taking the Floor. So this really talks about the negotiations and the language and basically the entire text. So with that, I will pause here for any questions that we might have. If there's anything that I have, or if you feel that there's anything that I've missed out that you want to maybe bring to my notice, or maybe if the organizers want to bring something to my notice as well.
Thank you so much, Hita, for sharing the valuable insights and answering all the questions from the participants so thoughtfully. And I'm sure our participants now have a better understanding of UNFFC processes and of negotiations, CMP, CMA, SBs, constituencies, and do's and don'ts of for the negotiations and other avenues where they can take part other than negotiations. So uh, now I would like to invite Ashish for some important announcement, because I guess you have covered all the important points, and thank you for sharing those important links with our participants. And I'm sure they'll get help from this. And Ashish, over to you.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Hita, so much for this incredible, informative session on what happens in COP and sharing your experiences. And I hope this would also help our participants understand the negotiation process deeply. So, with this being said, we are excited to announce, and this is an important information for all the participants, that we will be supporting some of the Youth for COP participants with the COP badges. And we would like you to submit your assignments as soon as possible, because this would be the key to get selected for the delegation. So this is one part. And since we are also a member of CANSA, so as part of, as Hita already mentioned, it is a very overwhelming process. So as part of the delegation, you will also be able to attend CANSA meetings, so that you can understand what is happening at the COP, just to get the debriefs of the negotiations. So that will also help add value to your COP experiences. So that is all. Over.
Ashish, you're not audible. Please continue.
Was I audible during the announcement?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much, Ashish. Now I would love to call Mr. Bhavesh for closing remarks. Bhavesh, over to you. You there?
Uh, Hita, first and foremost, thanks for such an insightful session, with the kind of comments that are coming, with the kind of questions you have asked, and the simultaneously you have answered them so beautifully and nicely out there. I feel it's a full circle in terms of understanding the things, in terms of making our audience appreciate what is happening deep dive out there. We hopefully feel that when they become future negotiators, when they represent their countries, their nations out there, for sure they'll remember this session, that yes, we learned some baby steps out there. So friends, as always, please remain in touch. Hita is available, our teams are available, Mr. Ashish is available, Dr. Sakshi is available for any kind of further help that you look forward to. In terms of session details, in terms of things that Ms. Hita spoke of, we'll be sharing you over email as time progresses, as she shares with us. So rest assured on those aspects. Some important announcements Mr. Ashish has already made out there. So all in all, we stand with you to take things forward in the rightful endeavor of it. And as COP is also approaching, we have approached the embassy of Azerbaijan as well. Hopefully, there would be some positive news coming for you in times to come. We are hoping to hear from them. And Hita, I understand it's a late night out there. Again, so thanks for being considerate and giving out your time. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. No, it's my pleasure, and thank you for the lovely questions. I can send all of these links on email to the Climate Reality team, and they can send it to you. So,
Please.
yeah, I mean, because there have been some comments saying you've not been able to access the chat. I put them all in the chat, but if for any reason, if you've not been able to access it, I've also added my LinkedIn to the chat if you want to get in touch with me. Yeah, and hopefully I might see some of you at COP. If you do come to COP and if you see me, please come and say hi and introduce yourself to me, because I have no faces and I will not remember any of your names in a few months. But yeah, if not at COP, don't worry, COP is not the only thing to be at. There is so much that you can do outside of the COP space. So please keep engaging. If it's not this year, it could be in another year. So yeah, I mean, COP is not the only place to be, and it's not the only climate action space. There's actually only one of the multiple different spaces that you can be at. So Yeah, keep doing what you're doing. I think that's what we need more than anything else at this point.
Great insights out there. In fact, that's the point. Take learnings out from there and implement it in the works that you are doing in times to come. And that's the whole endeavor of this Youth for COP program, where we'll be engaging with these people in times to come over a range of projects that they can implement on ground. So remain in touch, friends, and do subscribe to our social media handles so that you get rightful updates as they happen. Thank you so very much for the insights. Over to you, Sakshi.
Yeah, thank you, Bhavesh. Thank you so much, Hita, for giving your time. And now it's time to wrap up today's session. So once again, everyone, thank you for joining us and making today's workshop success. Thank you so much.